Another theme that you discuss in Wealth, Poverty, and Politics, inequality. Quote, once we put production at the center of our attention, our surprise at extremes of income and wealth, rich people, rich countries, poor countries, our surprise at extremes of income and wealth might suggest the question whether there are comparable extremes in the production of wealth and whether these two extremes may have something to do with each other. Setting the possession of wealth aside to focus on the production of wealth. And that is intellectually more fruitful if you really want to know why some people are poor and some people are rich. That's the argument.
Absolutely. One of the painful things, I came from an earlier era when we were taught, that the reason we have electric lights is because of Thomas Edison. The reason people can now afford cars, whereas 100 years ago, 1% of the American families had a car, is because Henry Ford figured out how to make cars a lot cheaper. And various other things, we understood that. You never hear that these days. All you hear is that somebody is rich somehow, that for some reason, like it dropped out of the sky or something. And it's true, Bill Gates has more money than I guess some countries. But of course, he created more than some countries. But at the very least, you can ask the question, and you can find out maybe that wasn't true of others, maybe it wasn't true. Yeah, but the fact is that question is kept off the table in most discussions now. They act as if somehow this guy has all this money, and as if it's almost as if you're implicitly assuming a fixed amount of wealth in the world, and if he has more, somebody else must have less.
And so you're being quite dispassionate at the moment, but that actually makes you angry because all kinds of people, including students at pretty fancy institutions, but also poor people in this country and elsewhere, are being told, consider the political question. Consider means of, look, rich people, they must in some way be to blame. For goodness sake, over half of 18 to 25-year-olds said they supported Bernie Sanders. A majority of the youngest voting cohort in this country supported a man who calls himself a socialist. And your view is, at a minimum, that's going to cost them time. They're wasting time. What they need to understand, you need to understand what are the habits that lead to production. Correct?
Yes, the question is, why is there wealth in the first place before we get into the question of how it's distributed? Because if there's no wealth, there's nothing to distribute.
Okay. All right. Another of our present-day luminaries, Hillary Clinton, quote, now, Tom, I haven't even given you the quotation yet.
But I'm just thinking of Hillary Clinton as a luminary.
All right. Quote, economists have documented how the share of income and wealth going to those at the very top has risen sharply over the last generation. Some are calling it a throwback to the Gilded Age of the robber barons. As Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, I saw the way extreme inequality has corrupted other societies, hobbled growth, and left entire generations alienated and unmoored. That's what happens when your only policy prescription is to cut taxes for the wealthy. Close quote. Now, she says that inequality is dangerous in and of itself. You have too much of it, and you're going to alienate generations, corrupt societies, hobble growth. Purely as a matter of analysis, is that correct? Do we have evidence that inequality in and of itself dampens economic growth? No.
I'd be very interested if she has any. I saw her make the same kind of statement using the 1920s as an example. That was another Gilded Age. The 1920s was were among the most prosperous, high growth decades in the history of the United States. I was thinking on the way over here about someone criticizing President Reagan, and they were saying that when the stock market crashed in 1987, Reagan did absolutely nothing. And they're saying he should be like Franklin D. Roosevelt and seize control and so forth. Instead, he's acting like Calvin Coolidge. And I thought, under Calvin Coolidge, unemployment ranged from a high of 4.2% to a low of 1.8%. Under Franklin D. Roosevelt, it was over 20% for dozens of years consecutively. So we live in an age where rhetoric prevails, and no one cares about the facts.
All right. Get ready for this one. Economist Paul Krugman.
I'm sitting down. Go ahead.
All right. Income equality is bad for democracy. I'm going to take another run at you with this one. Income equality is bad for democracy. The ugliness of our politics is tied to the inequality of income. The people who have the most influence are not interested in having good public services because they don't use them. You just get a bad society, close quote. So you don't buy any of that. You don't buy this notion that the elite in this country, the top 1%, the ones who have somehow disconnected, they don't live like ordinary people. Therefore they just don't care about. They don't care whether the government is effective for ordinary people.
Oh my goodness, it's hard even to know where to start. These percentages are so trash. I recently did a column based on Mark Twain's statement that there are three kinds of lies: lies, damn lies, and statistics.
Right.
And these percentage statistics. Let me give you statistics. Piketty has said, these top people, these top 10% he used as an example. They have such disproportionate influence and so forth. They sit atop society and all of that. And and if you get into the statistics, you discover that 53% of American households are going to be in the top 10% at some point or other in their lives. You talk about these percentages as if these are ongoing, the same set of people in this bracket, that bracket. And most Americans do not stay in the same 20% bracket for for more than 1 decade. So much less for life.
So it's largely a life cycle. You're poor when you're young, and you're doing fine when you're older.
Yes, and there's nothing mysterious about that. Probably most people in this country, when they started out as entry-level jobs, were not making what they're making when they're 40 years old.
Right.
Heaven knows I was being paid $2 a day to deliver groceries and depended on tips for the rest.
All right. Staying with inequality for just a moment, because it's such a big theme in the current electoral cycle. Once again, wealth, poverty, and politics. Quote, the welfare state, which, by the way, is the recourse of virtually everybody who's concerned about inequality. Let's redistribute from the rich to the poor. Fine. So we expand the welfare state. And you argue, quote, the welfare state reduces the incentives to develop human capital, and receiving the products of other people's human capital, that is getting money from the rich if you're poor, is by no means as fundamental as developing one's own human capital, close quote. What is human capital, and why does the welfare state suppress the incentives to develop it?
Well, human capital is the ability to create the material things that constitute wealth. People have been puzzled by the fact for a long time that after a major war with huge destruction, once peace is restored, the economy gets restored often in a very few years. I think Western Europe after World War II, everything that was there was bombed, and they wonder why. How can that be? And John Stuart Mill explained this back in the middle of the 19th century, that the material things are going to be used up and wear out, whether there's a war or not. And so it's really the ability to reproduce, to operate those things, to maintain them, and then reproduce them was necessary. That's the real wealth. And so when you destroy the physical wealth, you really haven't done as much as if you destroy the human capital. A classic example, in the 1970s, Uganda decided that the Gujaratis from India were just too wealthy and controlled too much of the economy. And they sent them out and they wouldn't let them take their wealth with them. And so the Gujaratis arrived, mostly in England, destitute. And the Ugandan government has taken over all this material stuff. Over a period of a relatively few years, the Gujaratis were prosperous in England and the Ugandan economy collapsed because they didn't have people who could do what the Gujaratis were doing. And so they no longer had the same production. It's also one of the problems with trying to finance things by confiscating the wealth of the wealthy. All you can confiscate is the material wealth. You cannot confiscate the human capital.
So the true wealth, the enduring wealth, the wealth that leads to wealth in the material world is between people's ears.
Absolutely.
And why does the welfare state suppress incentives for poor people to develop their human capital?
Of course, you can live off what other people have produced. And it's not just a welfare state. It's true among nations. Spain, for example, during its heyday in the 16th, 17th century, it received gold and silver literally by the ton, something like 200 tons of gold. If you can imagine, gold is normally measured in ounces. So they get 200 tons of it from the Western Hemisphere colonies. They get, I think, some 1,800 or something, 1,000 ounces of silver. And so Spain didn't have to develop its human capital, and it didn't. It bought whatever it wanted because it had all of this. But when all of that money was spent and the colonies broke free and so on, Spain had nothing. And so Spain is today one of the poorest countries in Western Europe.